Hello, everybody. A very good morning. This is the first keynote of the conference, so everybody's awake, Joseph. Let's bring it on. Yeah. All right. The keynote entitled Sustainable, Responsible, Regenerative, Bridging Theory, Practice, Policy, and Advocacy in Tourism and Hospitality. And we have here with us Joseph Chia. He is the Professor of Sustainable Tourism at Center for Tourism Research, Wakayama University, Japan. He's also Adjunct Professor at the Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand, Visiting Professor at UCSI University, Malaysia, and Visiting Research Fellow at Open University of Catalonia, Barcelona, Spain, 2022. Joseph is also co-editor-in-chief of the journal Tourism Geographies, and according to Scopus Site Score Tracker, the first-ranked journal in the tourism, leisure, and hospitality management subject area, and second-ranked in geography, planning, and development. Joseph is also joint specialty chief editor for the New Frontiers in Sustainable Tourism journal. Joseph has been around the world as lecturer and visiting professors at universities in various places. Joseph is also board member of the International Geographical Union Commission on Tourism and American Association of Geographers Recreation, Tourism and Sport Group, and steering committee member of the Critical Tourism Studies Asia Pacific. Joseph has received funding from various research councils and foundations in Australia and Japan. He has also published 10 books and over 70 articles and book chapters, and has written numerous articles for The Conversation and the World Economic Forum, and is a regular commentator for Nikkei Asia Japan. His work is published in prominent journals such as Annals of Tourism Research, Journal of Sustainable Tourism, Tourism Geographies, and Dialogues in Human Geographies, amongst others. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get Joseph to share with us. Go on, Joseph. Over to you, yes.
Testing. Okay, everyone can hear me. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Madam Mukwinder, for that warm welcome and all the advertising. It's always important to get the advertising out early. It's an honor and a privilege to be representing the Center for Tourism Research at Wakayama University in Japan, officially the #1 tourism research university publishing in English in Japan. And I'm very proud to be representing the center. I'm also very happy to be here to speak to a diverse audience. Usually I speak to academics largely, but in thinking about speaking to industry, community, and students, the incentive is to be clearer is there. So I hope I achieve that. Also, as a visiting professor to UCSI, the Faculty of Tourism and Hospitality Management at UCSI University, this is the first time I've had the pleasure to visit. So I hope I can do this more often. Many of the distinguished guests have been acknowledged already, so rather than repeat what's already been said, I'd like to acknowledge everybody attending today, and everyone online as well. I know some of my colleagues in Australia and Japan online, so welcome. But most importantly, before I start my speech, the formal part, I want to acknowledge Associate Professor Dr. Hiram Ting. The Minister is here. So I would like to suggest that Sarawak should come up with a Captain Sarawak. You know, Dr. Ting has already talked about Captain America, right? But why not have a Captain Sarawak? Sarawak is is very lucky to have Dr. Ting. His leadership and vision in establishing this event and everything else he does. I wonder how he finds the time to sleep. So thank you, Hiram, for the invitation, for your tireless efforts, and I look forward to coming back when you are officially bestowed Captain Sarawak with your cape and your suit. And to all the staff and students as well who have helped make this event possible. Enough of that. Let me get on to the presentation for today. Andrea and I have set up this telepathic communication. She'll know when to switch to the next slide. And I thought I would use slides, right? Because there are many students here who might want to identify where it is that I'm getting all of this information from. Much of it comes from my own research and things that we've written. But I also know that the organisers have put a copy of the editorial to the Journal of Responsible Tourism Management in your bags. So much of what I refer to comes from that. So my opening proposition argues that in the shadow of the pandemic, the issue of responsibility has taken on even greater prominence. As we have come to understand so intimately, individual responsibility is linked to higher level social, environmental and economic outcomes. Ideas of responsibility can be seen clearly in this simple contestation over mask wearing, right? In Japan, where I live and work, mask wearing is not contested. No one argues about it. A culture of individual responsibility and the impact this has on well-being is accepted. By contrast, in Australia, where I'm from, mask wearing is questioned by many and considered a breach of human rights, and that individual responsibility means that we should be left to make our own decisions. Of course, this holds the common good to hostage, right? The common good that is very much a theme of today's conference. So, if we can't agree on a simple action, such as mask wearing, ensuring responsible tourism practices and behaviours remains a challenge. So in responding to the theme of the conference, it is clear that responsible tourism must transcend the popularized rhetoric, rather than just be words, and move beyond what tends to be referred to as greenwashing, whitewashing, cleanwashing, which is the new term that's come up around destinations wanting to make themselves appear to be virus-proof. So, what is responsible tourism? And I thought it's important that we set some definitions and some groundwork as to what we mean when we talk about responsible tourism. It's clear, and this is what comes through in all of the previous addresses we've heard this morning. It requires a long-running commitment and action, but most importantly, it requires effective partnerships. And this is the key, one of the other keys in this conference: partnerships across many stakeholder groups. In my ambitious agenda to talk about this, I suggested a very long title. I probably won't get through everything, but I will try. So I want to focus on sustainable, responsible, and regenerative, three concepts in tourism that address the things we are talking about here today. And this idea of bridging theory, practice, policy, and advocacy is important. If, as academics, we're only talking to academics, what is the point, right? If we're not engaging productively with government, with industry, with communities, then why are we doing this? And this is a hallmark of what Associate Professor Hiram Ting is doing here with all of these engagements. So, when it comes to the three concepts I will discuss this morning: sustainable tourism, responsible tourism, and regenerative tourism, it's important to note that these are not types of tourism like golf tourism, or gastronomy tourism, or religious tourism. Rather, they are ways of thinking about tourism and planning for the outcomes that are generated. So I have two aims. The first is to draw distinctions between all of the three ideas: sustainable, responsible, and regenerative. And the second is to link theory with practice, policy, and advocacy in tourism, and not just be an academic for the sake of publishing papers and writing books that no one reads or has no impact on policy and planning. So, if we talk about sustainable tourism, if we talk about sustainable tourism, it has its roots in the 1987 Brundtland Report by the World Commission on Environment. Anyone who studied sustainable development would know this, right? And one of the main assertions made regarding sustainable development was the need for intergenerational equity. And I suspect it is why the organisers put the children on the stage first, right? Because everything we do has an impact on the lives of those children when they are adults. So sustainable tourism, therefore, is defined as having an eye on the planet for the future generations to come. And what we do in the name of tourism needs to reaffirm intergenerational equity. Responsible tourism is discussed at length in our opening editorial. You have it in your bag, so I won't go over it too much. But one of the main things we talk about there is that it's tied to responsible and mindful consumption and production concerns. So every time we decide to consume something, or we look at the production process, we need to ensure that responsibility lies at the heart of that. But rather like the melting of Antarctica's ice sheets, the drop-off in tourism signals the urgency for us to implement adaptive approaches toward recovery and resilience building, what Liz has already said, or we run the risk of continued and permanent decline. And in many ways, Sarawak represents the last Eden, if you like, right? As the Minister said, it's the original forest. And how do we keep it that way? But when we talk about responsible anything, but responsible tourism in particular here, as Singaporean scholar Hung Lu Sin, formerly at the National University of Singapore, says, when it comes to responsible tourism, who are we responsible to and what are we responsible for as consumers, as producers, as policymakers? When it comes to responsible tourism, one of the earliest scholars to have taken a critical view on responsible tourism, Brian Wheeler, said, responsible tourism has grown as a reaction to mass tourism. And we all know what mass tourism is, right? We've seen it. And responsible tourism has become caught up in the groundswell of green issues and championed as a suitable way forward. And responsible tourism is rooted very much in the idea that we can contribute to responsible consumption of travel and the wider sustainable tourism discussion. But more recently, another term that's come up beyond sustainable tourism and responsible tourism is this idea of regenerative tourism. I'm sure I will see it in the policy making, in the policy documents to come. What is regenerative tourism beyond this idea that it's a silver bullet or a solution to all of the things, all of the problems that we see from tourism? So I'll spend the next couple of minutes talking about regenerative tourism. So regenerative tourism ideally promotes tourism by embedding tourism practices within local communities, the very things we heard here today. I think Liz said travel local, consume local, buy local, or something like that. Eat local. That's right, spend local. And what always bothers me is in all the tourism research I've done, often tourists will go to a far-flung place, yet want all the trappings that they have at home. It doesn't make sense. Like when I think of destinations like, and no offense, but if I think of a destination like the Maldives, on an island atoll out in the middle of nowhere, you know, a fully air-conditioned chalet in the middle of the Indian Ocean seems to me irresponsible in a sense, right? If we follow what Liz says about being locally focused, I think we get closer to regenerative tourism. And this is important for Sarawak as well. Regenerative tourism draws on Indigenous peoples' continuous living cultures. Typically, when we think of regenerative development, Indigenous people know about that. It's embedded in what they do, in their living cultures and their perspectives and knowledge systems, Western science and practice. So these influences form the basis of the ecological worldview, because let's face it, without a healthy environment, all the rest becomes irrelevant, right? So regenerative tourism is based on the fresh understanding that the visitor economy in general and the destination in particular is not an industrial production line. If we think of the forest as an industrial production line, I suspect we're moving away from what is responsible. Regenerative tourism relies on a living network system embedded in a natural system called nature. But this idea of humans and nature being separate is a very problematic one because we must coexist. Regenerative tourism is about evolutionary and dynamic understanding about sustainability within the framework of living systems. So for us as humans, we only exist because of the living systems around us. When those systems are compromised, we will struggle. So in the end, these three concepts and the research and discussions that go into them mean very little if government, industry, community, and academic researchers like many of us can't mobilize for mutually beneficial long-term outcomes. But of course, tourism is a microcosm of the world at large. Humanity can't even agree on ways forward to deal with climate change or pandemic management. And it seems to me that this inevitably plays out in much the same way in tourism. How can we agree on tourism when some of the bigger issues we face remain problematic? So we come to this issue of partnerships. Sustainable, responsible and regenerative tourism is not easy to achieve without the partnerships that have already been spoken of before. But we know in tourism, partnerships tend to be complex, multifaceted, and subject to multiple legal frameworks and governance arrangements, and are often cross-sectoral, transnational and cross-border. I told Dr. Ting that when I arrived in Sarawak from Kuala Lumpur, I had no idea that I had to go through immigration again. I thought I was in the same country, right? But this is what I mean by partnerships being complex, and unless we work together on them, it's very difficult to achieve the things that we set out here. Partnerships matter in tourism, but they can be difficult to negotiate. I'm sure many of you know that. Different actors bring their own agendas to the table, and strengths as well as weaknesses when considering prospects for sustainable tourism development. Governments need to play their part, of course, but not simply by providing things like a generous budget for tourism marketing efforts, nor by regulating to the extent that compliance costs put small businesses under pressure and possibly out of action. Partnerships by their nature suggest shared goals, beneficial outcomes for all parties, joint governance, cooperative institutional arrangements, and inter and cross-sectoral engagement. Partnerships should seek to limit top-down processes and instead give agency and voice to the community and the grassroots who are away from where the power lies. But what types of partnerships can work most effectively in tourism? And in the next session we will talk about this a little bit. So tourism partnerships are not always formal, right? A lot of times collaboration through partnerships is a loosely coupled system of organizations and individuals that belong to various public and private sectors will come together in order to reach certain goals. And when we talk about the range of partnerships evident, there are a broad range of them, but usually we include public-private partnerships, community-based partnerships, such as seen in community-based tourism, bilateral partnerships, such as seen in what international development agencies do, multilateral partnerships, the UNWTO, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and those types. But the two main types of partnerships in tourism that I've seen in my research are firstly multi-stakeholder partnerships. In international tourism, this can be transnational, and they are quite common as we try to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals, right? I'm sure everyone's heard about the SDGs. Will we get there in 2030 is the question. Because before the Sustainable Development Goals were the Millennium Development Goals, which we reached in 2015. And of course, that was a major disappointment to the entire global community. What will be the fate of the SDGs is something that I await quite eagerly. The other type of partnerships we talk about are public-private partnerships. Often such arrangements are necessary where capital and or expertise outside the public sphere is used to direct the weight of responsibility away from governments and have this shared. Private sector partners are important. Very often, many of my academic colleagues will see the private sector as the enemy. Will see the tourism industry as the enemy to be contended with or to be dealt with, rather than see them as a proactive partner in what we are all trying to achieve. In conclusion, for stakeholders in tourism with a vested interest, responsible tourism practices, if adopted, can lead us toward achieving the aspirations of responsible and sustainable and regenerative tourism and of resilience building that Liz talked about earlier. But we need to move beyond buzzwords, right? Buzzwords like regenerative, sustainable, responsible, and move beyond the greenwashing or whitewashing that has become synonymous with more social and ecologically minded forms of tourism is rather what responsible tourism calls for. If responsible tourism is to be realized beyond an aspiration, as Professor Susanna Becken says, it calls for policy making and practice to adopt some of these ideas in practice rather than just as motherhood statements. So in conclusion, I draw on ecologist Heather Reid's dialogue on the limits of responsibility to understand and integrate broader notions of responsibility in theory and practice. And Heather Reid says this: the concept of responsibility in the face of climate change remains meaningful to people with any degree of control over how many flights they take in a year, how often they use the tumble dryer, whether they don an extra pullover or turn up the thermostat to get cooler or warmer. But it is impossible to trace the lines of responsibility between immediate actions and their consequences. In the face of wicked problems, linear conceptions of responsibility as accountability are no longer adequate, but questions of responsibility as attribution also begin to slip and slide. And with that said, I will conclude my keynote, and if anyone needs any more information, that QR code should find you to a place where you can get that. Thanks very much again.
Thank you, Joseph. Are there any questions? We have some time for questions online as well. Those of you online and anybody here would like to ask Joseph anything about what he's just shared with us.
All the answers are in the paper that's in your delegate bag.
Yeah. So it's all about making things relevant for universities like UCSI University, Joseph. The research that we do, how do we make it relevant for industry, for communities? It's all about partnerships, as you said, and not seeing the public sector, a private university like us, not seeing the ministries, the government agencies as our enemies, but rather partners. And that is very, very important, as you said, yeah. So I think that's key, right? How do we make research relevant? Because we were talking about it recently when we launched the Journal for Responsible Tourism and Management. And how do we share the work with practitioners, for example? I think that was one thing that was also discussed. How do we make it work for practitioners? How do we, bridge this theory with practice as well as policy and advocacy? I think that has always been a challenge, isn't it? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the word that comes up is harmonization, right?
Yeah.
How do we harmonize what can sometimes be competing and contradictory goals?
Yeah.
But how do we find a point where we can harmonize all of our common interests toward the common good, which I think is the key word for this conference. Mm-hmm. How do we work towards the common good?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, that's right. Anybody, any questions before we end the session?
This is like in my lectures. When I say any questions, everyone looks down.
And everybody looks down, yeah. All right. Okay.
My name's Audra.
Yes.
I love the content of what you had up there, Joseph. I think and your mention about the Maldives is interesting. I feel the same way. I'm very passionate about heritage, local food from a gastronomic perspective. We all grow up eating certain styles of food, and all of a sudden along the way we forget our heritage, our roots, and what actually ties us to the land. I sort of feel that it is a reality of life that the world revolves around making money, the capitalism that comes through with developing a country. Always, GDP is important, all that kind of stuff, how much, that's a reflection of how well you're doing as a country. But I think along the way, sometimes we forget that at one point in time, we were bounded, our roots were very rich in our heritage and our culture. How do you see in your research, your meetings with government, there is a fine line to developing a country, and I get commercialism needs to come into play at some point. How do you see in your research to sway that, and pretty much what Liz touched on as well, it's not all about making money, How do we bridge that gap in private enterprises coming in, because they've got the investment dollars, keeping intact the local culture and heritage of a particular location? Mm-hmm. How do you see that working?
Thank you, Audrey, for the question. There's no doubt that is a challenge, and I'm sure the minister would say that is a challenge he faces on a constant basis, and the UNWTO and PATA. How do we develop tourism with a view to achieving the common good? There's no doubt that tourism is an economic enterprise, and this idea of profit is central to economic endeavor, right? But then this is what I was talking to Sarah Curry from the Asian Development Bank about yesterday, is that if the tourism industry and the private sector is going to be able to do any good, they need to be viable, they need to be profitable, they need to be able to do these things from a position of strength. An unviable organisation isn't able to do these things. So often when we talk about profit, and particularly in academic circles, it raises a lot of tensions. You know, is profit necessarily bad? Yet I talk to my industry colleagues, they will say, for us to be able to implement some of the sustainability initiatives that we would like to do, we firstly need to do it from a position of strength, from a position of being able to make a profit. But of course, we need to strike that balance, right? You know, there's much criticism about the fossil fuel industry making mega profits. As an Australian, I know that, you know, that's a very common refrain, that the fossil fuel industry is making mega profits while consumers are paying higher prices for energy. How do we reconcile those things? I think for me as a humble researcher, I can make ideas and build knowledge, but how do we convince industry and policymakers that the balance needs to be struck? Yes, neoliberalism and profit-making is central to capitalism, right? And tourism is an industry, but tourism is more than an industry as well. It's a social good, it's a common good. So that's a very weak answer to your question, I know, Audra, because it's a very complex set of questions. Does responsibility have a part to play in that? And when I say responsibility, not just of consumers, of policymakers, of industry, and so on. But I better wind up because Liz has a question.
Yeah.
I just wanted to help you also answer that, because I think that, you know, I would say that right now we're at a really pivotal time when actually consumers are asking for more sustainable options. And it's actually the industry that needs to catch up with this consumer demand. And this is a great thing. You know, the wallets are talking now. And what they're looking for is more transparency on helping them make sustainable choices. They're looking for more substance because they're tired of the greenwashing. They know it's been a marketing exercise for decades, you know, to say that, you know, these are eco-tourists, eco-resorts, or it's been too much greenwashing. Consumers, particularly the younger generation, are more savvy. And I'm going to share a story that, you know, I was touring a 5-star hotel in Thailand recently, and I'm friends with the GM, and he said to me, we both have kids that are in their 20s, and he said to me, Liz, my kids grill me on my sustainability program, and they don't ask me, Dad, did you get rid of the plastic bottles? They ask me, Dad, are you using reverse osmosis to treat your water? And he's like, I don't know, you know. So the consumer research shows that, you know, particularly in our region, it's amazing, 90% plus from each of our countries here in Southeast Asia, 90% plus of frequent travelers say they want more sustainable travel choices. And we need to serve up what they're looking for. And so I think this is an important time when, you know, this will drive where the profitability is. You know, you need to make responsible choices from everything from developing your property to how you manage it day to day or your destination. And so let's catch up with what the consumers are looking for.
Thanks, Liz, for your help.
Hi.
Any more questions? Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Joseph. This is very useful and insightful speech. My name is Anne Ashton. I come from Nida, Thailand. And my question and concern is I'm really to support the local. Actually, yesterday I said I want to do the haircut. You know, they take me to the shopping center. I said, no, I want to go to local haircut. So I did. So what my question that...
Sorry, Anne,
yes.
we can't really hear you. You might want to remove
Oh,
your,
sorry. Okay.
yes, your mask. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you very much. So what I just to support, you know, we need to support local as well. And actually, you know, I want to do a haircut. I said, I want to go to local haircut. So, and I get that. And I, you know, go there. So my question that how can we merge between local residents? They can understand about tourism. So many local now, they want to welcome the tourists, but the gap what I found between the need of the tourists and the understanding of the local resident, maybe if you can give me some theory so I can do my further research on that. Thank you.
Locals, yeah. So how do we motivate? How do we connect them to the big picture, rather?
Yeah, just how
Yeah.
we make them to understand more.
Yeah.
And I know that local now is, a lot of tourists are going down to local more, and even in Thailand as well, and where I came from, Chiang Mai. A lot of people some of them have no idea about
Right.
how to welcome that.
So how do we get them on board?
How,
and,
how
Yeah.
can you have any theory and can give some,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne, for your question. Nice haircut. It's a really important question because it's about building capacity, right, from the ground. But I also sense that very often one of the things we expect at a destination level is that local people adapt to the tourists, rather than expecting tourists to adapt to the local context. And I understand what you mean about building local capacity so that they can engage more profitably. But at a higher level, I would like tourism, international tourism, and international tourists, rather than expecting the locals to adapt to the way they do things. You know, the old phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Perhaps in tourism, travelers need to do that. Change their expectations that everyone should adapt to them at the destination level, and perhaps say, I'm going to Malaysia, I will do things the way it's done in Malaysia rather than expecting to do them the way I would expect in Australia or Japan. But of course, there are other issues like, service. Those who are into service research will say the customer is always right. In tourism, we will say the tourist is always right. But practically speaking, the tourist may not always be right. And perhaps there needs to be a movement of travelers understanding that I, as a traveler, should adapt to the country I'm going to, rather than expect everybody in the country to adapt to the way I see the world.
That's what responsible tourism is all about, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Anne. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm getting the signal from Dr. Hiram already. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.